And not just you, your place of employment, your business, your bank account, everything that we faced, your transportation, all of that can be obstacles that you, as a leader in this community, would have to face in the aftermath of a catastrophic disaster here in this community. So when I'm talking about what happened in New York and some of the ways that we overcame those challenges, consider yourself as a business leader, as a community leader. How would you overcome those challenges working with your team in your place of employment? My role, the American Red Cross Disaster Relief Operation from October 31st until December 16th. I manage the group and activities. Whenever I go out, my job is to coordinate others. And I was honored and humbled to have that opportunity to respond to New York. And it wasn't just New York City, it was all of New York. It was the largest disaster relief effort we had faced in several years. The role of the American Red Cross in responding to a disaster is to provide care and comfort to the families that are and communities that are affected by the disaster. We're not there to put out fires, we're not there to run hospitals, we're there to provide care and comfort to families. We're there to act as a convener, to bring other people to the table to talk about how to overcome problems and challenges that are faced in the aftermath of a devastating disaster. And to act as the translation of the American people's support into action that is required on the ground where we can be, where you may not be able to. So the development of Hurricane Sandy, we don't start responding to a disaster after it happens. We start responding years in advance. We've actually planned for Hurricane Sandy before we knew what its name was. But we have a plan which says 120 hours before a disaster makes landfall, whenever it's still down in the Caribbean, what are we going to do if it heads north? So what we start doing is we make pre-landfall preparations and we start deploying resources and assets 120 hours in advance of the event. We had established relief efforts 120 hours out before landfall in 13 states. We set up for feeding, sheltering, staffing of emergency operations centers to establish communications, reporting back on what activities and what the needs are, and talking to the general public. And our public affairs activities aren't to talk to you to raise money. It's to tell where the shelters are, to tell where people can go to find a safe haven as the storm is approaching. All of these are essential activities, and they start 5 days before the storm makes landfall. We had some challenges with Hurricane Sandy. We needed to stage a workforce that could be deployed anywhere across a 16-state region because the disaster was projected early on, 120 hours out, to hit somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Maine. So how do you start responding to that? We deployed critical resources into nearby states, but not all the way to the front. We projected heavy snowfall in West Virginia. So it wasn't just a matter of responding, it was responding to a disaster through a disaster. It was an additional complication. There were also many concerns about the election day for November 6th. All of these are things that you wouldn't think are part of disaster planning, but we had to plan for what our response was going to be to shelter residents and how they were going to vote. These are considerations in our disaster planning. 24 hours before landfall, we started working closely with state, federal officials. We had 194 shelters open. We had 1,000 disaster responders on the ground 24 hours in advance. And we had initially engaged with our partner agencies such as the Southern Baptist, as the NAACP, the National Baptist. We started engaging with our partners to motivate them and activate them to get them where they needed to be to support the overall relief effort. We became the convener before the storm made landfall. Landfall hit. We had operations in 13 states. We had 1,300 disaster relief volunteers on the ground, 368 shelters open with 13,000 residents. So in the course of 4 days, we set up to prepare and house 13,000 residents. We didn't start responding after that, at that 120-hour mark. We started preparing years in advance. We started making agreements with local organizations, with churches, with other civic groups so that we had places to set those shelters up. We start that years in advance. We had 6.5 million customers without power, or roughly equivalent to twice the population of the state of Kentucky. That created some additional challenges for us. Transportation systems in New York and New Jersey shut down. Public transportation is used by about 4.5, 5 million people in New York City every day. So imagine 25 to 30% of a city's ability to move shut down, removed. We had difficulties with even getting into communities, and I'll show you some pictures that demonstrate why. It wasn't that we didn't want to be there, it's that we couldn't get there. Bridges were closed, tunnels were filled with water. We couldn't get there. We had resources on the ground, but we were responding to a community which had over 3 million people impacted. Volunteers getting into, and we're mobilized our volunteers from across the country to respond to this event. Imagine coming from the middle of Kentucky or the middle of Iowa and showing up in New York City. In downtown New York City, in a community that had no power, in a community that had no horizon. When you looked around, what you saw was big buildings without power. That's intimidating on a good day for some folks. For many of our volunteers, it was overwhelming. So we had to get past that as well. Transportation systems were shut down, so we had to figure out not only what to do, but how do you drive in New York when the stoplights are not working, the buses aren't running, the bridges and tunnels are shut down, and you're from out of town and your GPS only works part of the time because the signals are blocked by the buildings. There were enormous challenges that were faced as a result of this disaster. A few days after landfall, we had a thing called a nor'easter, which is another big storm. And one of the things that we know about New York in planning for New York is not one big city. New York is a whole lot of small communities. They are neighborhoods. There's Breezy Point, there's the Rockaways, there's Coney Island, but they are neighborhoods and they act as independent cities each and on their own. There are 5 boroughs. They each have a president. They act as independent cities. So the coordination activities with all of those different cities is a challenge in and of itself. We had to support and reopen shelters because we had already shut down shelters in New Jersey. We had to reopen them while we were still responding to the larger disaster. We had to figure out how to do bulk distribution of supplies, and I'm not talking cleaning supplies. I'm talking about blankets, water, food, to buildings that were 17, 20 stories tall with no power. And in these communities, many of the individuals living in those buildings had lived there all their life. Many of them had mobility problems. The elevators were out. They could not get out of those buildings. We had to go to them. We recruited community partners with everything from military cadets to youth volunteers to run up and down and knock on doors in buildings that were, some of them housed 500 families and had no power. But without us being there, lives were in jeopardy. We had to consider what to do over Thanksgiving. We were in the midst of a major disaster as we went into Thanksgiving. Talk a little bit about that. And our partnerships became critical. The Red Cross acted as a convener, not as a sole agent. We worked with partners.